Good afternoon. My name is Charles Jennings. I'm director of the Christian Regenhard Center for Emergency Response Studies here at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And we'd like to welcome you to this, our second event of the fall 2022 semester. Before we start on today's talk, just a few housekeeping details. For those of you who are first timers or are not familiar with the Christian Regenhard Center. The Christian Regenhard Center is an applied policy first responder research center at John Jay College. We've been in existence now since 2008. And if you're interested on our events, we have videos of past events on our webpage. If you're interested in events, you can click on those. Also, if you're interested in joining our mailing list, you can click our contact page and join now, which will direct you to join our listserv. We also maintain a presence on Twitter at RacersJJC. So for today's event, we're very pleased to welcome Brett Branco and Katie Graziano from the Jamaica Bay. Well, I'll let them do the whole alphabet soup. Basically, Brooklyn College, New York Sea grant, and they're running what I thought was a really interesting and innovative program that would be of interest to our audience, and certainly one that's really critical as it's come into sharper focus. Obviously, we've always had vulnerability to flooding here in New York City, but post-Sandy, there's a really renewed awareness of that. And then in the last few years, we've had a number of events that have been really catastrophic in terms of flooding. And so there's been a really interesting response in terms of the creation of FloodNet, which has got a long interdisciplinary history. And so without further delay, I'll turn it over to Brett and Katie to start the presentation. And so welcome to the Regenhard Center. I'll point out to everybody, participants, please keep your video off and muted, and all questions we'll take through the chat function. So take it away.
All right, thank you, Charles. I'm going to just start by sharing my screen. And I guess we can do some introductions. Can you see the slide right now?
Yeah, we can see you.
Okay, perfect. So thanks everyone for joining. My name is Katie Graziano. I work for New York Sea Grant, and I'm a coastal resilience extension specialist. And my position is based in partnership with the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay. And I'll let Brett introduce himself.
Thanks, Katie. So hi, everyone. I'm Brett Branco. I'm an associate professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center. And I'm also the director of the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay, which is a CUNY-wide institute created in 2012. And it's a partnership between CUNY, New York City, and the National Park Service. And what Katie and I are talking about today is one of our projects that we do collaboratively. So I'll just leave it there and turn it back over to Katie to start the presentation.
All right. So today we're going to talk, starting off with a little bit of just the basics of flooding in New York City, and kind of like flooding 101, sea level rise 101, like what are we seeing happening in New York City? I'll talk a little bit about the New York City Community Flood Watch Project, which I coordinate with Brett, which is community science or citizen science local flood reporting. And then we'll get into more detail about the New York City FloodNet, the flood sensor network that Charles mentioned that's newly launched. So to start off, basic background, flooding is increasing across New York City. If you live in New York City, I'm sure you know this. Maybe if you live in certain low-lying neighborhoods, you might be seeing it even more frequently. But essentially, across New York City, residents are really noticing more flooding and bringing attention to increased flooding. And you can see that also using something like 311 reports, where you get a high-level view of how prevalent flooding is. And just seeing that it's a problem across the entire city, kind of no matter where you are. So there's two different types of flooding. Well, there's essentially two different types of flooding that we're seeing in New York City. Inland flooding, also called urban flooding, or coastal flooding. And so we'll start with inland flooding. Inland flooding is caused by precipitation. So heavy rainfall over a short period of time or over several days can accumulate and cause either just kind of like ponding, or it can also cause really intense catastrophic flooding. So an example of inland flooding is flash flooding. That's what we saw with Hurricane Ida. And inland flooding is made worse by climate change because rainfall events will be getting more and more extreme, as in there'll be more precipitation over short periods of time. That's part of the climate projections for New York City. But also equally important, this kind of urban flooding is made worse by poor drainage and lack of pervious surface. So of course, New York City is highly urbanized and developed, so there's very limited surfaces, like natural surfaces, where the water can drain off. And so that causes these flash floods to be even more severe than they would be otherwise. This here's a picture of an example, a tragic example of urban flooding this is Hurricane Ida. And I also just wanted to point out some interesting research that's been coming up lately about this kind of flooding, where looking back at the history of New York City, you can kind of predict, we're looking at where we're already seeing flooding. So if you look at a map of the flooding hotspots across New York City, and then lay that onto a map of New York City from, say this is recreated from the year 1609, you'll see that where we're having the most extreme flooding in New York City is almost perfectly overlaid with what used to be streams and lakes and rivers and wetlands in New York City. And so I think this information and the kind of research that's coming out can be really helpful for preparing for flooding by helping to like look at these historical maps, and we can have a better sense of where to expect flooding and where to kind of plan for interventions today. So that was all a quick overview of urban flooding caused by rainfall. The other type of flooding that I actually deal with more frequently is coastal flooding, which is flooding coming from the ocean or a tidally influenced body of water. So with coastal flooding, we're seeing this in the low-lying neighborhoods of New York City, especially around Jamaica Bay, and but also in like Lower Manhattan, parts of the Bronx, around Coney Island. There's two kind of types of coastal flooding. The first is storm surge, which is a more extreme rise in sea level caused by forces from a storm's wind, waves, and low atmospheric pressure. An example of that is Hurricane Sandy. But Hurricane Sandy is a very extreme example of storm surge. We also have every hurricane season, like right now, we always have storms that are passing offshore and creating a little bit of a storm surge. So you have like a foot or 2 feet of storm surge causing flooding in these low-lying neighborhoods. And then another issue or another type of flooding is high tide flooding, which we also call sunny day or nuisance flooding. And that is just caused by higher than average high tide. So it's not associated with any kind of storm event, just caused by the tides. And if you look at these photos on the right, you can see a little bit more about how ways that we see this flooding in New York. The top photo is, this is in the Rockaways. This is Jamaica Bay, where at high tide, the water is just coming up over land and flooding into a street. But then the lower two photos are showing another way that flooding happens, which is it comes up through the existing infrastructure. So there's water that bubbles up during high tide from storm drains and floods streets in that way. And then the lower left corner photo here is interesting because that's a combination of high tide and precipitation. So something else to consider in New York City is if a precipitation event coincides with a high tide event, there's clearly nowhere for that rainfall to go. So they kind of exacerbate each other. And coastal flooding, just like urban flooding, is made worse both by development and by climate change. Climate change because of sea level rise and increased frequency of storms, and development because of changing the shoreline dynamics through hardened kind of like seawalls and creating a more hardened shoreline changes the dynamics of the water, and it makes that tide come in faster and redirects water in places where it otherwise wouldn't go. And an example, this is a picture of a storm surge, an extreme example of storm surge, Hurricane Sandy, 10 years ago. And then this here is this is a sequence that'll show what high tide flooding looks like. This is a neighborhood in Hamilton Beach, and you can see the water this water is coming up through a storm drain, and you can see it just kind of peacefully expands across the parking lot here at high tide. Quick little background about high tide flooding. I don't know how interesting this is to everyone, but I think it's very interesting. Tides are caused, the daily tide is caused by the moon and the rotation of the moon around the earth. And so the reason that some of these tides are higher than others is because of the position of the sun and the moon. So the highest high tides, if you're ever curious and kind of, if you don't already experience high tide flooding, if you ever want to go out to Jamaica Bay and try to catch an extremely high tide, the best time to go is during the new moon and the full moon, because that is when the moon and the earth and the sun are all aligned. So the gravitational pull is exceptionally strong, and that creates a higher than average high tide. Happy to answer any questions about that. To me, it's really interesting to think about, but it's just to know that this is all connected to the lunar cycle, and that is why higher than average high tides are kind of a typical part of the tidal cycle. That being said, with sea level rise, what used to be just like a typical high tide is now getting worse because the sea level is rising around New York City. This graph is showing the level of the sea at the Battery in Lower Manhattan. And it's showing that over the past 100 years, the water level has already risen by about a foot. And so that's why we're already seeing more and more high tide flooding around New York City. And let's see what's the next slide. Okay, so this is the historical data. So this is showing what has already happened, but that's projected to accelerate even faster in the future. So by the year 2050, it's expected to rise more than another 1.5 feet. So that's just in the next 30 years, we're going to see even more sea level rise than we saw in the past 100 years. This is to just point out that a small amount of sea level rise can translate to really big changes on land. So 1.5 feet maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but if you kind of like measure that up a meter stick and then draw the line out to the land, that actually affects a huge area of land inland in New York City when you start thinking about what that sea level rise will look like on the ground. So like I said, the high tide flooding, the sea level is, high tide flooding is getting more and more frequent in New York City. So in the year 2000, there were only 5 days where the water level was high enough to cause flooding on the streets in New York City. In 2021, it was 13 days. The projections say that by 2050, that will be 60 to 85 days out of the year these neighborhoods will be inundated by high tide flooding. To help visualize what that looks like, this is kind of a typical high tide flood that we're already seeing in Hamilton Beach, Howard Beach, Far Rockaway. These are neighborhoods around Jamaica Bay. So right now, this kind of level of flooding happens maybe once a month, maybe once every other month. But by the year 2050, this will happen 85 days out of the year. So like once every 4 days, this is the kind of conditions that a resident of these neighborhoods will have to deal with. And that's just that is just the flooding caused by the moon and the sun and that gravitational pull that doesn't even take into account the storm surge that is bound to coincide with it, or rainfall that's also bound to coincide with it. I don't know if I'm allowed to take questions, but yeah, just think if you have questions, I guess just put them in the chat or save them for later.
Yeah. We'll take questions via chat until we get through the the presentation, but you're free to take those in real time if you like.
Okay, however you want to do it. I'm happy to take them or save them for the end. Some of that, it's a lot of information, so just want to make sure everyone is staying with me. So the reason all this matters, the reason that it matters that flooding happens in New York City and it's getting worse in New York City is that, of course, flooding impacts people and services. Some of you may have already experienced this firsthand, but some examples are it affects public infrastructure, especially saltwater affects all of the stormwater infrastructure in the low-lying areas. It affects access and transportation. I've heard stories from residents that I work with of emergency vehicles not being able to access a home during an emergency. So like fire trucks not being able to access a home, ambulance not being able to go down. And then other services like you can see in these photos, garbage, sanitation trucks, mail delivery. I've heard of people who haven't had their mail delivered in weeks because every day the mail truck comes at the same exact time that happens to be at high tide, so they can't get down the road to deliver the mail. So flooding is really impacting these basic services of people living in New York City. It's affecting their homes and housing properties. There's a lot of damage to cars if you're not paying attention to the tides, and some people will remember to move their cars. If not, a lot of lost property in terms of cars. Health and safety. Of course, there's potential pathogens associated with flooding. And an interesting one is also emotional and social well-being, where just kind of like the stress of having to worry about this chronic flooding is really affecting people. And if you're interested in digging deeper at all into these impacts of high tide flooding, but it does kind of apply to all types of flooding, but my more expertise is high tide flooding. So we did a research paper. We interviewed residents to learn more about the impacts of flooding. And this is just in New York City. And so through this paper, we came up with a list of these different kinds of impacts specific to flooding in New York City. So happy to share more about that if anyone is really interested in digging into that. So finally, so that's flooding kind of 101 impacts, causes. And so the New York City Community Flood Watch Project started in 2018 when residents in these neighborhoods in New York City started documenting the flooding that was happening on like Facebook and other social media, but it was sort of like neighborhood by neighborhood. And there was all this really good information about flooding impacts and like where it was happening, but there was no way to collect it and kind of like share it. And so, so people outside the neighborhood didn't really know what was happening on the ground. And even neighborhood to neighborhood, people didn't know what was happening like to their neighbors in the neighborhood over. So we started Flood Watch with resident support and with our community partners to have like a standardized way to collect these flood reports. So we created a survey form, and it collects a photo of the flooding, where did it happen, what was affected by it, and like the time and the date, and just so all that information goes into this flood report, and then it goes into this common database. So not only can you see like, oh, like I just submitted this photo in my neighborhood and I can see someone else is dealing with the same thing, but it also provides access for city agencies or anyone else who's not living on the ground and doesn't really know what's happening. This kind of puts like eyes on the ground of what's going on in different neighborhoods in New York City. But since we started Flood Watch, we were also very conscious to not make it's not just a way to report flooding. It's really a way to build communication between these different entities that are all related to flooding and flood resilience, but are kind of siloed and don't necessarily have opportunities to communicate. And so we actively engage residents, scientists, and government agencies in the Flood Watch programming. And so we work with the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. We work with the Office of Emergency Management. We work with the National Weather Service. We have scientists who are partners and who provide a lot of the forecasting. And then, of course, we work very closely with residents who volunteer their time to go out and collect flood reports. And to date, our volunteers and community partners have submitted over 710 flood reports from across the city. Mostly when we started, it was this kind of like coastal flooding, but we're seeing more and more, especially since Hurricane Ida, more and more people raising awareness of that inland urban flooding and also submitting photos of that. So we're capturing quite a bit and a lot of really rich information about what's going on the ground. If anyone wants to participate, we just launched a new tool to take the place of that survey form that I mentioned. It's called My Coast. So it would be awesome to get more kind of boots on the ground volunteers. So if you're interested, you can download the My Coast app or go to mycoast.org/New York and you register, and then you can submit a flood report, and that goes into our newly developing database. And that's for any kind of flooding, tidal flooding, precipitation based. It's also a way to document storm impacts. And there is a high tide event potentially on November, around the new moon. So it looks like the worst of the flooding could be on Thanksgiving Day, which could be disruptive to people living in these neighborhoods, having family over. There's no way to drive down the streets. But that'll really depend on whether there's any sort of like the wind direction. So if you keep an eye on it, you might there might be a flood event and an opportunity to participate. This is just to say that we're not the only, New York City is not the only place dealing with flooding and not the only place interested in getting hyperlocal data. We recently learned about this program in Indonesia where they're using social media posts. When people post about flooding on social media, it gets they get redirected to this survey form. And so they're collecting like thousands and thousands of flood reports in Indonesia during their monsoon seasons. And their emergency management and response teams have already like made use of all of this really valuable data. So that was a really cool example from across the world, but there's plenty of other examples of this kind of work that's been getting more and more popular with more and more flooding that we're all seeing globally. And so I'm going to be passing it off to Brett to talk about flood sensors, but I just want to make the connection really quickly between this Flood Watch program and flood sensors, where with Flood Watch, although we have this very rich information, there's a lot of data gaps. And so essentially, like, unless we have a volunteer in a certain neighborhood who's out at that time, we're missing a lot of we're missing flood events because it relies on having someone there. And then we're also missing certain neighborhoods where maybe we haven't done as much engagement, or so there's data gaps associated with community-based flood reporting. But with the flood sensors, we were all super excited to get to be a part of this flood sensor network because it really helps to fill that data gap. And so I like to just point out how complementary these two programs are to each other. With FloodWatch, we built these community relationships, and we can actively engage volunteers through community data collection. And then like the photos, a lot of these photos that I'm showing are coming from FloodWatch, and that provides this visual and narrative context that sensor data is really cool and really precise, and but it doesn't have that like visual power of a photograph. And so the data sets together, I think, are a great combination. And whereas then the flood sensor helps to validate the data that's already coming through from the community flood reports. And so I'm excited for the flood sensor project and to kind of see how they both grow together. I think that's everything. Yeah, so that's everything I have. And I'm going to stop my screen and pass it off to Brett, I think.
Thanks, Katie. Let's see if I can do this successfully. Great. Are you guys seeing, Katie, are you seeing my presentation now?
I see it.
Perfect. Okay. And by the way, just before I go on, I did see a good question from, I think, Wendy in the chat about what we can do to minimize the impact of that increased tidal flooding that Katie mentioned. I think that's a good discussion point for at the end of the presentation. So Wendy, remind us to come back to that question. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the FloodNet program. I think it's always useful to talk about the origin story for projects like this. And one of the part of the origin story is that the city, particularly the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, and the city's Office of Emergency Management were always important partners on the Flood Watch program. And a few years ago, it was the city who first brought up the idea of adding flood sensors to the community flood reports for many of the reasons Katie already outlined. And so they asked us if we could start working with, was there a faculty member at CUNY or someone within our research network that could start developing flood sensor technology? And we found a researcher at the CUNY Advanced Science and Research Center, Ricardo Toledo Crow, who runs the Next Generation Sensor Lab. And he got all excited about this project. And we also started working with the Center for the Study of Brooklyn at Brooklyn College, because we wanted, if we were going to deploy technologies in neighborhoods, we wanted to make sure that that was coupled with a very strong community engagement process, so that we weren't going into neighborhoods sort of like without their permission, to be putting up flood sensors, because we wanted to understand what the implications of that might be and how communities might find that information useful. We wanted to have a strong community engagement component to it. So as we were starting to develop that effort, it also, turns out that there was a group of engineers at NYU's Center for, or the CUSP program at the Tannen School of Engineering, and they were developing sensor technology for street flooding because they were interested in the contaminants that might be left behind by receding floodwaters, but they were having a hard time figuring out like when to go out and sample. And so they wanted to develop flood sensors so that they could see when a flood was happening, and then they'd go to the lab and get all of their sampling supplies ready. And then when the waters receded, they could run out and take samples from the sidewalk to see what kind of nasty organisms might be left behind in the floodwaters. So the city helped to put our two groups together, because it turns out that the sensor technology Ricardo was working on was almost identical to the sensor technology that the NYU team was developing. And then the project just sort of took off from there. So I really like this as a good example of user-driven research that I think is important, especially for public institutions like CUNY to engage in. So anyways, yeah, I just really like that origin story. So the FloodNet project, is this collaboration between NYU, the CUNY Advanced Science Research Center, the New York City Mayor's Office. It's not actually, this is wrong now. It's now the New York City Mayor's Office of Information and Technology, or Innovation and Technology, and the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, and the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay. See, it's interesting, right? How city agencies' names change so often that this slide became outdated in like a year. Why did we need flood sensors if we already had FloodWatch? Katie already talked about that a little bit, but just flood data in general. For community members, it provides information for their advocacy to help them solve the problems that they're experiencing. It helps with day-to-day decision making, like Katie mentioned, like where do you park your car, and are you going to be late for work because you can't wade through hip-deep water, and also can validate community-reported flood events. Like, so for example, if someone calls into the 311 and they have that data available, it just adds more legitimacy to their reports. And for government, this kind of information is useful for informing infrastructure planning and operation, transportation, resilience planning and monitoring, and emergency response. Hyperlocal information about flooding, where it's happening, how severe is it, what's the extent of it, can help inform emergency response in real time. can inform road closures. So we know a lot of deaths that happen during flash flooding happens because people try to drive through water and they don't realize how deep. A lot of rescues anyways come from people trying to drive through water, not realizing how deep it is, or people not realizing how rapidly the water is going to rise. So it can inform road closures, and it can also help guide post-flood assistance. And then for the research community, this kind of information can help validate predictions of flooding from different types of models. It can help us understand how interventions like infrastructure projects can change the amount of flooding. And like in the NYU example, it can also help inform water quality testing or other types of sampling that you might want to do to better understand the full impacts of a flooding incident. And a lot of this so how can we monitor urban street level flooding and provide this data to various stakeholders to serve all these different needs? And if you're interested, we have sort of written all this up in this paper available through water research that I can provide. I think it's open source. So the FloodNet consortium, the goal of this large team is to develop a water level sensor network to monitor hyperlocal street level flooding. And so there's really two parts to this. One, well, actually more than two parts, but the two communicated here is, so design, build, and deploy low-cost, robust sensors across New York City, and develop tools to make that data available to contextualize and communicate data to a range of stakeholders. So the city, the communities, the research community. There's a lot of different target audiences for these data. I already mentioned the consortium. The names are correct here, right? The New York City Mayor's Office of Technology and Innovation, Climate and Environmental Justice, but we also work a lot with community groups. So here's just this is sort of like a lot of the early communities that we worked with. Sometimes it was building on existing relationships that we had. The New Hamilton Beach Civic Association has been a super important one, Gowanus Canal Conservancy. So pretty much, across the city, we have connections with communities where we have already deployed some sensors. So the sensors themselves are able to sense water depth with an accuracy of 5 millimeters or half a centimeter. They can collect and transmit measurements every minute. They can operate autonomously in an environment for long periods of time. And that's primarily because they were constructed to consume very small amounts of power, and they're also solar powered. So we don't have to. They have a battery, but they're also solar powered. So we do not have to connect to any city energy infrastructure for electricity. They're completely autonomous. So they operate independent of existing power and networking infrastructure. They're made from low-cost components, which is super important because this sort of technology, existed, and you could have gotten sensors deployed, even 5 years ago. But the sensors at that point might have cost you, many thousands of dollars, and we've got the cost of these down to less than $240 a sensor, which is really important if you want to do large scale deployments. And they transmit the data that they collect via a low range wide area network. So it's just basically a radio network. We have these different gateways installed across the city that can collect data from any low LAN device within approximately a kilometer. And so we can run a whole bunch of different sensors, off of one gateway that collects the data and transmits it to our servers. So these sensors, they're ultrasonic, meaning that they're constantly, that they send little sound pulses that they bounce off the surface beneath them. And knowing the speed of sound, we know the speed of sound, and we can time how long it takes for that sound beam to bounce off a surface and come back to the sensor. And from that, we can figure out the distance with very high precision. So that's essentially how they work. So they're just constantly measuring the distance to the surface below them. Most of the time they're bouncing waves, sound waves off of the sidewalk or the road. But if there's water, those sound waves are bouncing off the water surface. And we can measure that change in the distance that sound wave travels. That's basically how they work. And here's a photo. This photo shows what one of our sensors looks like. And for those of you who might like to see the guts of electronics, this is sort of what the guts look like, right? There's a little, battery powered, there's a little battery in there, circuit board, and that's pretty much it. A pretty simple device. And this is what one looks like deployed. So because of our relationship with the city, we've gotten sort of permission to mount these things to signposts, which are convenient, right? Because they're all over the city. So we can mount them to the signpost. They're fairly inconspicuous. Unfortunately, we've found that they resemble too much a camera, and people are really wary of surveillance. So we have to think about our signage and our design to make people less wary of or suspicious that we're putting out a bunch of cameras to film what they're doing, because that's not what we're doing at all. We're just bouncing sound waves off their sidewalk. But anyways, we try to put signage up to let people know what these are and why we have them. I should also mention, actually, let me go back for a second before I go to that. I should also mention there's actually two sort of designs that we have. And I think I might have one in a later photo, but the second design, which was really the CUNY design, is it's the same exact transmitter or sensor, but we have it enclosed in a big PVC pipe that we can strap to things like a utility pole. So you can't really see the sensor. All you see is like a big PVC pipe, which we paint green to make it a little more inconspicuous. And all you can really see is the solar panel sticking out the top, which is really small. So we have one of those, for example, out in Hamilton Beach, and we have one out in the Rockaways. So, the other piece of this is making the data available. So for the last year and a half, we worked with this tech company called SteelKit to develop a dashboard, a data dashboard, to view the data. And if you're interested in, I'll share the link later to the dashboard so you can access it yourselves. I just have some static screen captures here to show you what it looks like. And this is, if you go to the website, this would be the first view you see, where each of the blue circles indicates a currently active flood sensor. So we have, I think, 28 around the city, at least one in each borough so far. The color gives you a quick view of whether the sensors are picking up any significant amounts of flooding. So the scale is, blue is no flooding or flooding less than 4 inches. Minor flooding, it would turn yellow if the flood depth was between 4 and 12 inches. Moderate flooding between 1 foot and 2 feet, and then major flooding, those dots would turn purple, and that would indicate that they're experiencing more than 2 feet of water. And then the number in the middle also gives you the sort of exact reading of that sensor, at that particular moment that you access the dashboard. So, this one's kind of boring, but yet good, right? You want to see a bunch of blue dots with zeros in them, because that means that there's no water on the streets. But if you came to this dashboard while there was major flooding in different parts, you would see different colored circles with the flood depths indicated. If you click on a blue dot, you will get a little card for that sensor, a little preview, which will give you some information about it, like where it's located, when it was deployed. It'll give you a little 2-day time window so that you can see what the flooding trace, if there were any flooding in the last, in the previous 48 hours, you would see it in this little preview window. And then there's a button here to click to explore the data. And so now I'll just show you again, because there's no flooding anywhere in the city right now, or at least not where our sensors are. We have a couple of sort of examples prepared so you can see what the data might look like during a flooding event. So it just so happened that we had one of our sensors deployed at the intersection of Carroll Street and 4th Avenue in the Gowanus neighborhood during during Tropical Storm Henry, which, if you might recall, there were two different sort of like rain bands that came through. So in this particular view, you're seeing flood depth is on the left axis, so it goes from 0 to 30 inches. And on the far right axis, it shows precipitation in inches per hour. So you can overlay precipitation data with the flood sensor data. And so the blue bars is the precipitation, and then the black line showing the double peaks, that's the flooding. And so you can see the flooding at this intersection, which approached almost 30 inches during Tropical Storm Henry in this particular location. Here's another example from Hurricane Ida. This is again at Carroll Street and 4th Avenue. So again, you can kind of see, when that extreme band of precipitation came, it very quickly increased the amount of water at that intersection to almost 3 feet. Something approaching 36 inches, which is a lot of water and very dangerous to have that much water on the street. And I'm going to show you now, because Katie talked a lot about the tidal flooding, and we forget how much of an impact that twice monthly tidal flooding can have in low-lying areas around places like Jamaica Bay. But here's an example of flood sensor data from a location. It's Beach 84th Street in the Rockaways. And in this plot, this is showing a 2-month period. And the blue line is tidal data from a NOAA tide gauge that's in close proximity to this location in the Rockaways. So it's showing you the water level in Jamaica Bay. And one thing that you can see just from the blue lines is that the high tides change over the course of the month, right? There's two periods during the month when the tides increase and then decrease, right? And that's, again, like Katie explained, related to the full moon and new moon cycles, right? When you see these really large amplitude signals of the tide, that's a full moon. And these other larger than average, but not quite as large as the others, that's the new moon. And then the in-between periods are when you're at like the half moons. So anyway, so you can see that twice monthly pattern of the full moon, new moon. And then more importantly, when we do get a full moon and the tidal amplitude increases and we get these higher than average high tides, you can see that the flood sensor on Beach 84th Street, which is the black line, picks up the flooding. And in fact, at the highest of the high tides experienced that month, the water reached almost a foot of depth, or actually it exceeded a foot of depth. And you can see the close correlation between the height of the tide and the amount of water that ends up on the streets of Beach 84th Street. And in this plot, it's just kind of zoomed in on one full moon flooding event, so you can just more clearly see how closely related the tide is with the amount of water that appears on the street. So again, this happens on Beach 84th Street every single month. There was a story in the paper over the summer, or maybe from last spring, where the residents on that street actually used the local, they had NYPD come to the end of their street. Or actually, they drove through the water to pick their kids up at the house because they couldn't wade through the water to the bus stop. And so the police came and helped get the kids to school because there was too much water on the streets for them to get to their bus stop. Really kind of sad situation, but you can imagine how much stress that puts on the residents there. Okay, yeah, so here is Beach 84th Street. So yeah, so you can see an example of the water on Beach 84th Street, and this arrow is pointing to more or less where our flood sensor is, which is the style where we have it enclosed in a big PVC pipe strapped to this fence. So you can see the power of the flood sensor data, right, which is continuously recording, whether there's water present or not, coupled with these photographs gives a much more full picture than just a photo alone or just the flood sensor alone. So where's the FloodNet project headed? So it's interesting because we had been working on this for over 2 years. And the city was, we were partnering with the city as we were working on this. But it wasn't until Hurricane Ida hit that the city recognized the potential of these sensors to really help out with their stormwater resiliency and emergency management work. So after Ida, the city became very interested in investing in the FloodNet project. And so now, actually, I literally just got the city contract on Friday. But with that money, we and CUNY and NYU are going to deploy up to 500 sensors over the next 5 years, spread all over the city. We're going to create manufacturable sensor designs so that they can be mass produced. There's a lot of there's a lot of work to do with like the data handling as we upscale. We'll actually have a workshop tomorrow to start to really think about, if you have 500 sensors, where do you put them for the biggest impact? You have to think of a whole bunch of different reasons why you would want a sensor and what value they have and whether they're equitably distributed across different communities, et cetera. There's a lot for us to think about in terms of like exactly where we're going to put these sensors. We're going to work very closely with communities to make sure that the data are accessible to them and that the data are being used in ways to help them and not just the city. So we have a lot of work to do now that we have this investment from the city in this project. And this is just a list of the team, some of the team members that are working on this. It's a constantly evolving list of people. And here's our contact information for both Katie and for me, and links to the two projects, the FloodWatch project and the FloodNet project. But maybe this is a good time to stop and have a conversation and take questions.
Okay, Brett and Katie, that was really fantastic. It was in my somewhat objective opinion, excellent science communication. And so I'm going to take the first crack at this because I'm just really excited. This is, I think first of all, this is, for our emergency management students, it was under Craig Fugate, the FEMA administrator, and COVID time, I can't remember, he was under the Obama administration, who basically coined the notion of whole community response to emergencies, right? And so it's really interesting to see this kind of emergence between citizen science and whole community response and what is really a significant issue in the city. And as you're all aware, the post-Ida, when we lost all the people in basements, primarily in Queens, but in other places, and it was very widely dispersed. And there were a lot of questions raised at that time about, well, how do we notify people for these kind of very idiosyncratic events, in terms of putting it up against a traditional flood map. So having said all that, do you want to talk just a little bit about how, why is this kind of, you put it up against like the FEMA flood maps, which I think most people are familiar with, versus kind of the quote unquote, the real world of flooding in New York City, where we have all these other factors that come into play. And as somebody just pointed out in the chat, it could be as simple as storm drains clogged with leaves or debris, right? It doesn't even have to be low lying. It doesn't take much to create a problem. So do you want to just to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll start on that one because I think I got distracted by the whole idea of the storm drains actually. But yeah, no, in terms of like what kind of information you pair this with, there have been different efforts, and actually one of them was led by CUNY well before Ida actually. It was one of my colleagues at Brooklyn College and a whole team of people from other universities and CUNY campuses did this project with the city. It's called the Stormwater Resiliency Research. So they were trying to help the city come up with better ways of understanding where flooding would occur in the city, street by street, under different rainfall scenarios, right? So there was a modeling component to that, and a mapping component, and a data validation component to it. And actually, you can go and access those maps now. They basically only have two scenarios worked out, sort of like a really extreme rainfall event and then like a medium rainfall event. But we're getting closer and closer. I think this is getting to your point now. We're getting closer and closer to being able to make pretty good forecasts for folks, right? Like if it ends up raining this much and you live here, you might expect to get X amount of flooding. You have to know where to go to find that information, but like that information is becoming more and more available. What the sensors can do is they can help validate those predictions, every time a storm event occurs. But they can also, alert people in real time in those areas, when they are actually experience that flooding. But I think the forecast part is important, right? Because the FEMA maps are so hypothetical, and there's such a general area, they're really general area maps. Whereas like the stormwater resiliency maps the city produced are literally street by street, forecasts of what the water depths might look like. And similar work is being done by researchers at Stevens Institute of Technology. So there's this system called the Stevens Forecast Advisory System. And maybe Katie, you know what, maybe I'll let you talk a little bit about that and how you actually use that in the community floodwatch program.
Yeah, sure. And I could also drop that in the chat, the link to Stevens. But yeah, to kind of build off of that, and I was having a similar thought. Forecasts, like the messaging that comes out of the National Weather Service, is very broad. It says like there could be flooding in southern Queens, and it's really not specific enough for people to react sometimes. And so what we try to do with FloodWatch is make it more specific, like the last time, say, like communicate it in a way that's easy for people to kind of imagine what the flooding will be like and where it will be. So I can look at Stevens, see that it's going to reach a certain high tide, and then I can send out my email and my Facebook messages and say, last time it hit this tide, there were 8 inches of water on this street, and like just to give people a reference of what that flooding might look like. So I think with more hyperlocal data, it helps facilitate like messaging that's more specific neighborhood by neighborhood, and that makes it more kind of like actionable for residents in those neighborhoods.
Okay. Let's see, we have a question here on kind of the big picture, I guess, in terms of mitigation. Where do you see this heading in terms of efforts or initiatives that are going on around either changing development patterns or kind of abandoning some of the development that's in particularly vulnerable coastal areas?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I think it's related to the very first question that Wendy asked, right? Which is how do you reduce the impact of the tidal flooding? So it's an interesting way that you phrased that question, Paul, because I think that our goals, honestly, I think it's fair to say that our goals are to make sure that all the different end user groups have the information that they need for whatever it is that they're interested in achieving, right? So like if it's emergency management, it's like just knowing like where do people need help right now, right? Because there's 3 feet of water in their streets or there's water coming into people's basements. I think for the bigger picture in terms of like the city's efforts on mitigation, I think that once there's enough sensors out there, when you pair that with other kinds of data collection and other types of modeling efforts, it can help to inform what kinds of mitigation strategies might be appropriate. But I think more important than that, it can help evaluate the effectiveness of those mitigation strategies. So, if you decide to do like a stormwater upgrade project, can we see a reduced occurrence of street level flooding in a neighborhood like in Canarsie, right, where they just did a big stormwater project? If we had sensors out there, which we don't, we could see, do they experience less flooding now than they did before that project? So I think it's more about making sure that people are fully informed about where where ideas need to be, or projects need to be implemented, but what those projects are. I think that the specific projects go beyond the scope of what we're doing, right? Which is providing the one data input into all of this. Maybe a little bit of a cop out, maybe, but not really, right? Because it's not. There's so many different solutions, and there's no one size fits all sort of mitigation strategy, right? You have a very large toolbox of strategies. So yeah, it's not really up to us to choose whether we rewild or raise the streets or put in a campaign to make sure that the leaves aren't clogging the storm drains, which is a super important issue. But we want to make sure that there's some data driving decisions.
Charles, you're muted.
Thank you, Katie. So I just want to remind people to send their questions in via chat. Another issue here. So what's the status of the system right now in terms of your connection, or is there a connection? Is anybody at New York City Emergency Management, pulling this page up during heavy rains, or is that still kind of a future activity?
You want me to answer that, Katie?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, right now, everything that we've done to this point has been with kind of like seed funding from NYU or seed funding from CUNY, us like being creative about resources. So with all that, we've only got 28 sensors deployed, right? Which provides a very limited sort of functionality at this point in time. But with that being said, every time it rains now, we're hearing from our city partners, hey, what's going on? Like, they're looking at them and they're asking us questions about what they're seeing. We still have some work to do in terms of like data filtering to make sure we don't get like right now with the design. Like, I can give you a good example. Someone put a children's desk out on trash collection day, and they put it right underneath one of our sensors. And so, we're just sitting there, and all of a sudden, like instantaneously, it showed like, oh, now there's an 18-inch flood at this sensor location, and it's been constant all day. So like we knew that wasn't a flood, right? That was someone putting obstructions. We got to figure out ways to sort of filter. But when those happen, we hear from the city, like, hey, what's going on with this? What's going on with that? And we also have like these, we've been having these monthly sort of like all agency updates. So we get like the Department of Transportation, Emergency Management, Sanitation, DP, they come, find out what's going on, talk about use cases and things like that. So I think they're anxious to get the 500 sensors so that they can really have the full functionality.
Well, I think you anticipated the question we've got there now. And so this leads to one of my pet issues, which is the analytics, the data analytics piece, which is a big, in a lot of this emergency response thing, everybody is quick. Then it's like, look, I've got a sensor. And then you get to the point where, okay, well, now we have 1,000 of them. And how do we know, when something's going on? So are there resources allocated to try to work through that issue of, obstructions and all the different variations of what could go on in terms of being able to trigger kind of a real world action, for the various government agencies and actors, or alerting to the people in the community?
Yep, good question. There's two pieces to this, right? One is the data filtering, which Ray and Wendy just kind of brought up. And I'll talk to that in a second. And then the second one is like the stewardship of the sensor location, right? So on the data filtering, some of the engineers at NYU are actively working on this. So you can do things like, we know that the floodwater can't rise 18 inches in 1 minute. Like that would just be, that's obviously, like sometimes you get like these little blips before we start filtering them, right? And if it goes up to 36 and then comes right back down a minute later, that that's a false reading. Maybe someone walked into the sensor or something, but so that's easy to filter out. You can have an algorithm to filter that out. Or if the reading instantaneously goes up and just is a constant value for many different, for like a half an hour, that that's a false reading. So you can filter that out. So you can do it based on rate of change, and you can do it based on like how steady the reading is, kind of. And also, you can also couple that with like, it didn't rain, or it's not a full moon, and we don't have a storm. So it is possible like a water main could break and cause some flooding, but we can figure that out, I think. What do you do though if there's an obstruction? That's a good question. And those are things that we're trying to think through, right? We still have some hard work to do. The CUNY design, where it's inside the PVC pipe, helps to minimize that kind of like obstruction false positive, because you're basically physically preventing anything from getting beneath that sensor with the PVC pipe. But I also think an important part of this is like community stewardship. Now, you can't go asking people to go take care of your sensor or to go like check every day to make sure there's not a bag of trash beneath it. But there are some people in some of these neighborhoods that do take on that kind of role. For example, in Hamilton Beach, one of our sensors sits right across the street from the president of the New Hamilton Beach Civic Association. He's a huge fan of this project. He actually coordinates a lot of like information sharing within his neighborhood. And he alerts us every time he sees something weird in the data, or wants to alert us to like, hey, your sensor's showing 2 inches, but there's no water on my street.
Right.
And he'll send a picture too. Mm-hmm. Right. So, through community engagement, part of it is like maybe we can foster a sense of stewardship around this with certain key community members who are invested in it. Also, maybe we can get, we'll figure that out. We have to figure that out.
Sure. And then I just occurred to me, what are these things affected by snow?
Yeah. Anything that a sound wave can bounce off of will. Okay. Yeah. So if there's a snow pile, that's another thing that we have to think through. Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see. Send those questions in. I'm just looking here. I guess there's a question on if there are plans to expand it beyond, I love it, different states other than New York City, which is a classic New York City response. Yeah. But is there plans to, are other people calling you or?
Yes.
Okay.
The short answer is yes. In fact, like in the last, couple of months, there's a group down in Florida. There's a group out in Texas. It's hard to keep track of them because they contact different people within the team, so it's hard to keep track of all the. I was recently approached by a team from Israel that want to talk about this technology and what we're doing, and everything's open source. So we share everything that we do through GitHub, so that people can access this, but also we'll talk to people and help them figure out how to set things up. We've been doing that with a group in New Jersey. I'm trying to help them get their sensors set up and running, etc.
Okay.
I'll also add that it's not just other states, it's also outside of New York City. We still don't have any sensors. So, but like with my coast, we're encouraging people all across New York State to participate because New York State has a ton of coastal zone areas from Long Island to Hudson Valley up in the Great Lakes. So there's a lot of opportunities to expand beyond the city, but so far we've only expanded with the citizen science portion of that.
Okay. Yeah, and I think certainly I'm thinking about things like the Hudson River. People are very sensitized to that, and there's already people doing things looking at pollution and all other kinds of measurements. So that would resonate. Do you have any connections in particular with the communities that were affected by the flooding back in September of last year in terms of getting sensors put in there?
Yes, that is a priority area. Once we've been kind of, how should I say this? We've been a little frustrated with the pace of support, getting the support, through like the contracting process. But so we've been getting lots of requests. So we like on the NYC FloodNet.NYC website, anyone can go and actually like submit a request for a sensor like in a particular place. But also, there have been some conversations with community groups out in that area of Queens. And actually Roger, who we work with in Hamilton Beach through this other work that he does, has connections in that very neighborhood. He's been doing some relief work there. And he put us in touch with a specific individual to talk about like where sensors would be most useful in that community to help protect lives. So the short answer is yes. And as soon as we get the resources to make some more sensors and go install them, that's one of the first neighborhoods that is on our list.
Okay, well, that sounds great. I just while you were talking, I looked up on a credible site that said the average insurance claim for an inch of water in a house is $11,000, right? Which is probably pretty legit. And we think about the economics when you put out, the cost of the sensor is under $300. Obviously, the labor and everything else to put it in and everything. But it's this seems like it's a pretty wise expenditure on the part of the city in terms of trying to avoid loss and improve the ability to respond to what's a problem that I think is here for the foreseeable future, right? And and any thoughts on? Okay, hold on. Oh, there's another question. You can read that question in the chat, and I'll
sure. This question from Joy.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of people trying to think creatively about these problems and how to improve the situation for people. In the city employs some of them, but I think also in the nonprofit sector, in the academic, in higher education, I think CUNY is a great source of thinkers about these things, right? So yeah, I think that there's a lot of people thinking about these, and I think it's more and more people thinking about these. I think it's an important area. So thinking as a CUNY person, I think this is an important area to engage students in as part of their education. So yes, Joy, I don't know, like if you were looking for like some very specific ideas, but definitely there are a lot of knowledgeable thinkers that are trying to actively, creatively combat flooding.
I'm going to go ahead and share the screen with your homepage for the Science and Resilience Institute and give you a chance to do a brief infomercial about kind of the interdisciplinary nature of the work that you do, which I think is really exciting, and you guys certainly embrace it. And as I do that, there was a question I was going to ask, which came in and came right out. So I will let you go ahead and talk about a little bit more about partnership and some of the things you're doing at the some of the different expertise and skill sets and that you engage with through the Institute.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's yeah. So, the Institute was specifically created to be what we call a user-driven research institute, primarily focused on Jamaica Bay, but not exclusively focused on Jamaica Bay. And it kind of emerged from a desire by the city and actually the National Park Service to better, collaborate and cooperate on the management of Jamaica Bay. Everything from climate adaptation to resource stewardship and water quality and wildlife and communities. And it was all sort of centered around this idea of resilience. So, that's a pretty big charge. And in order to address problems of urban sustainability and resilience, it's very much an interdisciplinary endeavor. You need social scientists, you need natural scientists, you need engineers, you need planners, you need artists and humanists to help sort of inspire and communicate and bring out that creativity, right? So we try to infuse interdisciplinarity in all of the things that we do. Our topical areas are primarily these days flooding, nature-based solutions to urban problems, and building community capacity to engage, civic capacity to sort of be part of the problem solving themselves, right? So we do a lot of community engaged work as well. But one of the exciting things that we're doing right now, in partnership with a lot of external partners, is we're putting in this CUNY planning grant to start thinking about an urban futures hub located at Floyd Bennett Field, which blends arts and humanities and social science and natural science around things like urban sustainability and urban resilience, sort of as a way to sort of like catalyze, creative thought about problem solving. And it'll be, we have this great vision for this, right? And it'll be available to CUNY and beyond, right? So that's in the works. If you go on the field trip, Charles, you'll see exactly what we're talking about.
Okay. Well, that was great. Katie, do you have anything you want to expand on that front?
No, I think that was a good summary.
Okay. Okay, we're going to give last call for questions from the audience, and then I'm going to throw out one on this is not, you can take a pass on this, but I'm assuming you guys are pretty savvy with the status of wastewater and sanitary sewer infrastructure along the bay. And I know there were issues. I mean, there's perennial issues about stormwater management, and then do we still have sanitary sewers that get overwhelmed during heavy rains and puts raw sewage into the bay?
Yes.
Okay, and we're all against that. So where are we on cleaning that up? No pun intended.
So another project which we are doing with the city is looking at different nature-based solutions to that very problem. So there's two sides of it, right? Trying to reduce the occurrence of those discharges, but if those discharges occur, trying to reduce the harmful impacts of them. So we're looking at the reduce the harmful impact side of it right now. But one of the ideas that the city has proposed, which is very forward thinking, is to use ribbed mussels, which is a very hardy bivalve that grows by the millions in Jamaica Bay. And they actually will eat the bacteria, the human pathogens. And so we're looking at the possibility of installing extremely large numbers of them in this one basin of Jamaica Bay by JFK Airport, so that every time there's a storm event that causes the release of sewage, that the ribbed mussels will just eat it all up.
Okay.
And kind of building off the nature-based solutions too is another thing the city is doing, is installing more and more green infrastructure, so that like things like rain gardens or like just like boxes under the storm drains that'll help retain water longer so that it's not overwhelming the sewer system, the storm drain system. And so we're having fewer and fewer of those kinds of overflow events. So in both cases, kind of this like turning to nature to help solve that problem.
Right, right. Well, this has been great. Thank you both, Brett and Katie, for a great presentation. I think it was very salient for our attendees, and we certainly wish you the best. For those of you who had picked up, so we're through the Regenhard Center, we're going to affiliate with the Science and Resilience Institute. So you know, and I've looked, they've got one planner, and we'll have now another planner and an emergency management person. So it's really exciting, interdisciplinary, integrative, and exactly as you say, what CUNY should be doing, and very intellectually, you know, challenging and exciting as well. So I'd like to thank you both for the time and for the information. Once again, I just want to thank Katie and Brett for their great work, and we will see you the next time. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us, and thanks
Okay.
for everyone's attention.